So I recently got into small form factor PCs and I asked myself, what is the smallest form factor PC that could be created? I came across a case called the Pyron Man 5, which was meant to house a Raspberry Pi. And so I figured I would create a sort of YouTube tutorial chronicling my journey towards assembling and getting this to work. So first off, let's talk about some of the parts that are required. Well, of course, the first thing you'll need is a Raspberry Pi. Here I'm running a Raspberry Pi 5 with about 8 gigabytes of RAM, as well as built-in Bluetooth and Wi-Fi. Next part we'll need is a micro SD card for the initial flashing of the operating system. The operating system I'll try to get working is called Twister OS, as opposed to the conventional, Debian or Ubuntu operating systems. We'll see how it goes. There's no guarantee it's going to work, but it seems to have been recently updated for Raspberry 5, or Raspberry Pi 5's compatibility. Now here we have the Pyron Man case right out of the box. It's not assembled, but it does support also housing an NVMe drive. And that's what I have over here. Now, the goal behind using the NVMe drive is to see if we can actually boot directly from the NVMe drive as opposed to the micro SD card. This is because Raspberry Pi 5 recently, with the release of Raspberry Pi 5, they now have functionality to support booting from NVMe drives, much like an actual computer. And of course, we'll need an NVMe enclosure, primarily to format the NVMe drive into something like exFAT, since that would be compatible with Linux-based operating systems. And of course, we'll need a computer to download the operating system, and some peripherals like a keyboard, mouse, USB-C power supply, and a monitor with HDMI capabilities. So on that note, let's get started. First off with the assembly of the case. So just a quick update, in order to actually enable the NVMe boot functionality, you have to update the Raspberry Pi bootloader. So right now I've just flashed a miscellaneous utility tool for the Raspberry Pi 5 called the NVMe USB boot. So we're going to put that into the Raspberry Pi while we assemble it with the NVMe drive. And my goal is to use the same Raspberry Pi imager to install Twister OS onto the Raspberry Pi. So we'll see if we can get it to boot from the NVMe drive, but worst case scenario, we just boot from the micro SD card. All right, after a painstaking 3 hours, we finally have it working. So as you can see, even though it's plugged in with power and the USB peripherals are connected, the case fans are still moving, despite the fact that the system is technically not turned on, so to speak. I'll explain why that's the case in just a second and how to fix it in a later step. But for starters, let's power it on and see what we get. So you can see that the light goes from red to off, and now it's on green. And if we look at the monitor, you can see real quick, it's booting from the NVMe drive. So if you look over here, you'll actually note I have no micro SD card because, well, I just want to boot straight from the NVMe drive. And yeah, like I mentioned before, I'm running Twister. That's a nice sound. I'm running Twister OS, which allows me to go back and forth between a variety of themes. So it's connected to the Wi-Fi, because when you use the Raspberry Pi imager, you can configure your Wi-Fi credentials. And the next step we want to do is addressing some secondary or optional, options. So as part of the tutorial, you'd also want to configure the shutdown so it actually deactivates the GPIO power, which is where you would have to basically modify the EEPROM configuration file. So that's what I'm going to do now, and we're going to see if that fixes it. So the first thing we're going to want to do here is configuring the shutdown to deactivate GPIO power. In theory, all you need to do is add a line to the boot configuration file where it basically says power off on halt and set that to 1. So once you're ready, you can exit sudo, save, and enter. So there we go, update successful. I'm going to restart this, well, I'm gonna power off, turn on, power off again, and see if the fans remain off in the powered off state. So yeah, we can see that even though it is powered, it's in its off state, hence the red LED. The LEDs for the fans are off, the fans themselves are off, and then if we press the power button, it turns on like any other desktop PC. So let's take a look and see it booting in. Again, loading in the operating system Twister OS from the NVMe drive because we don't have anything in the micro SD slot. The one thing I kind of don't like is that the audio driver loads a little bit later in the booting of the system, so you can't really hear that Windows XP startup sound completely, just the second half of it. But I don't want to spend too much time troubleshooting it to try and get it to work. The other thing I noticed is that my Wi-Fi kept on getting disconnected. At least the Wi-Fi that comes with the Raspberry Pi. Now, it could be because this is a 2.4G connection, but I decided to plug in an external Wi-Fi adapter, just a simple USB one that supports a 5G connection. And now I can go to a web browser, if it'll let me. And yeah, we have a pretty solid internet connection. So that's the one other additional upgrade I recommend getting. I mean, the best case, of course, would be running an Ethernet connection because there are Ethernet ports available. But if you wanted something for the convenience of, just a Wi-Fi connection without running too many cables, yeah, get something like this TP-Link 5G USB Wi-Fi adapter. So I also just finished installing the Pyronman 5 module, pretty much just following the instructions listed in the documentation. And what the Pyronman 5 module essentially does is it allows a little OLED screen over here to show the CPU, RAM, disk utilization, and temperature. And then the second thing it allows is for the little LED lights up top to kind of fade in and out in like a dimming fashion. Mainly for aesthetics, but it's nice to enable that functionality. And you can even monitor the status of all of those parameters, CPU, RAM, disk usage, through the Pyronman 5 service. If you wanted to, say, remote into the computer or treat it like a headless environment, basically. So yeah, just to summarize, essentially if you follow the tutorial listed for the Pyronman setup as closely as possible, you really shouldn't have many issues with getting this to work. I was able to verify that it works with the latest version of Twister OS as of June 23rd, 2025. We used a NVMe drive, specifically an ADATA. I forgot the model off the top of my head, but I'll link it in the description. But yeah, this works with an NVMe drive, not a SATA SSD, so that's an important distinction to make. The only upgrade that I'd recommend that wasn't included in the setup is having some sort of external Wi-Fi source, presumably because the integrated Wi-Fi module, which I think is a Broadcom 2.4G one, is probably getting its signal attenuated by all the different hats, devices, and other things that might contribute to electrical interference. So it's best to get something like a TP-Link 5G connection. When flashing the operating system of choice, I do recommend enabling SSH just in case you might want to debug the system in a headless environment, because things can go wrong, and if you don't have an external display source or display adapter, then SSHing into it can help you troubleshoot some of the issues, assuming that the system is able to boot. And yeah, aside from that, I really don't have much of a use off the top of my head for a system like this. It's roughly the size of the palm of my hand, so it is quite small. And yeah, if you guys have any recommendations or suggestions or ideas for what can be done with a system like this, feel free to drop a comment below and I'll see if I can get it done. Thanks.